Welcome to the Sanity podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host Rebecca Sugar, we speak to the people that you want to hear from.
We're joined today by Dr. Charles Jacobs. I've known Charles for some time now, but I've followed his career for even longer, for decades. He's sort of a serial founder of human rights and pro-Israel organizations, which some of our audience might be familiar with. Organizations like CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, American Anti-Slavery Group, the David Project, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, the Jewish Leadership Project, and most recently in the winter of 2024, Charles founded the African Jewish Alliance, which is designed to educate the public and government about Islamic terrorism in Africa. He's written so many articles and published books and won awards, one from Dr. Coretta Scott King. He's even been arrested, so hopefully we'll hear some good stories about that too. And we're going to talk today about the problem of slavery, modern day slavery in Africa. And so, Charles, I wanted to just start. I actually looked up on the Global Slavery Index. People might be surprised to know that as of 2021, they were estimating 50 million slaves around the world. I think we have a certain view of what slavery means here in the United States. And so we think it's been abolished, but it hasn't. And I think there have been certain news stories about, the Uyghurs in China, or the hostages returned from Gaza who were enslaved in civilian homes there. And of course, all the human trafficking that's been going on across our open southern border. These are all forms of slavery, although we tend not to frame it that way. So let's start in the beginning. How did the Harvard grad who was working in the business world come to become a 21st century abolitionist?
Thank you for having me. I indeed was a graduate of Harvard, clop, clop, my chest now. And I was a management consultant, and I really was not interested in being a management consultant. And on a trip on an airplane to Minneapolis, I saw an Economist magazine piece on that there's slavery in Africa. You could buy a black woman in Sudan for $15. And I thought, wow, that's not possible. Why is this a little small piece on page 47 instead of glaringly on the front pages? After all, America. You would think that if blacks are enslaved today, that people would care. After all, we cared and we changed our country, and America almost slaughtered itself in the Civil War, and etc.
I mean, the man in the portrait sitting right behind you had a lot to do with that. I see Abe Lincoln is right behind you, Charles.
He's my hero. So what I found out is, we're about to enter a realm of truths that must not be said. Okay. So what I found out that in Sudan and Mauritania at the time, Arabs and Muslims have black slaves. And I started to read about it. I was shocked. I went to Amnesty International, and they had reports about this, but they were in the back files. They weren't organizing people to do anything about it. And that was
roughly, sorry, when was this? Give us a sense of the time.
It was 1993, 4 or 5. Okay. And so I did some research, and I found a Mauritanian Muslim whose people are enslaved. And he and I wrote a piece, and we broke the story in the New York Times. 1993, maybe. It was called Bought and Sold. And the story was that in Sudan, there's a Muslim Arab North and a Black Christian South. And there was a jihad declared. And jihadists would storm African villages, kill the men, all to the tune of Allah Akbar, rape, torture, and burn everybody else, and kidnap the women as sex slaves. And in Mauritania, where you have to remember that Islam started as a dot in the desert in Saudi Arabia and worked its way up into Africa, and as the biggest imperialist movement of the time, took over and forcibly converted blacks who were indigenous to the land into Islam. But in parts of Mauritania, the Arabs never thought of the blacks as really truly Muslim, and they enslaved them, even though in the Quran it says don't enslave full Muslims. And I went to New York. I couldn't believe anybody wasn't. The biggest shock to me was more that the West was quiet than that this was happening. I went to New York and I met with the diaspora elements of Mauritania and Sudan, and I put them together. So here's this Jewish guy, Christian Sudanese, and Muslim Mauritanians, and we started a movement called the American Anti-Slavery Group, and we worked to get this into the public sphere for years and years and years. And eventually I met the most heroic group, which was called Christian Solidarity International, which figured out a way to buy back the slaves that were taken in Sudan. And I went to Sudan 3 times. The last time was on Pesach, on Passover. What else should a Jewish boy be doing on that holiday? And we redeemed tens of thousands of slaves. Christian Solidarity International did that. I went on 3 trips with them. I brought the rabbi from Hillel at Boston University, Rabbi Potasnik, and the last we would go fly into a war zone, be protected by the South Sudanese Liberation Army, which was trained by the Israelis, it turns out, before. And we went to these redemption sites where Christian Solidarity and we raised money to pay Arab retrievers to go up north and bring back these people. We met them at the redemption sites. It was 110 degrees. It was awful. And we interviewed them. I have all these on tape. They're horrible interview stories. And then we redeemed them. And at one time on Passover, Rabbi Potasnik passed out matzah and explained to them that we too.
Not the best first meal in freedom, but okay.
That was amazing. So that's how I got involved. And I was arrested along with Curtis Sliwa. He and I blocked the South Sudanese consulate, the Sudanese consulate in New York City. We sat down on the street. It was a civil protest, and we spent a day in jail, Curtis and I. We could do a whole podcast on that day in jail with Curtis.
And we should.
Yeah. One other little incident that's interesting here is that Louis Farrakhan was not a fan of liberating these black slaves from Muslims. And he came to attack us. I had to get a bodyguard because for him, this is his Achilles heel, right? I mean, his thing is to tell blacks in America that Islam is the path to freedom. Well, not if you're in Africa and you're being jihaded by Muslims, and especially in Sudan, they had black Muslim slaves, Louis. So that's another interesting part of this.
Let me ask you, Charles, when you say slavery, right? Slavery has been in one sense, sort of a constant in human history for a very long time. On the other hand, it, takes different forms at different times. What was the nature of this slavery that you observed? I mean, were these domestic servants? Were they working the land? What kind of shape did it take?
Rebecca started off with a figure of 50 million slaves in the world today. There are more slaves in the world today than ever before. But most of those slaves are not the kind that we're used to knowing about in the South. That is chattel slaves. I mean, chattel slavery is you are the wholly owned property of a master, can be given away through your estate to his children like the furniture. Okay, that's the kind of slavery that happens in Africa today. And well, we'll get to today, but then, and these women and girls who I interviewed, the survivors of, they were taken by jihadists, raped there. I mean, there are stories that I was told. I mean, I'll get emotional, but they line the girls up and they try to rape the first one, and if she says no, they slit her throat, and nobody says no after that. They take them and they bring them to the north, where they become domestics and concubines of the jihadist masters who sell them or keep them. And in this kind of slavery, they didn't take men because, unlike in America, where you needed musculature to do tobacco and rice farming on plantations, here it was simply as a way of domination and using the wombs of the slave women to spread Islam. So that's the kind of slavery it was.
Can you define for us, is this a religious motivation? Is this slavery motivated by race? I sort of can't find the line between those two. Is it a combination?
Or something that kind of happens in a war zone? Obviously, Sudan is one of the most, violent and unsettled places in the world, and still very much today. I mean, so what are kind of like the circumstances?
It is both religious and racial. It's racial because there's a lot of anti-Black racism in the Muslim world that doesn't get talked about, but we could do another whole podcast about that. But it's also religious because according to Islam, when you do a jihad, the captives are, I forget the actual term, in your hand, and they're slaves, and you can have as many concubines as you like. And just to move the story ahead a little bit, 25 years later, when my daughter, who lives in Israel, called me up and said, "Dad, we're at war. The Arabs came, stormed the villages, stormed the kibbutzim, shot people, and took the girls as slaves, as sex slaves," I immediately knew that I'd seen this before because I was there. It is Islamic, or you could say Islamist, or radical Islamic. But this has been the way of jihad. This is a jihad. They're jihad slaves. And just like I could tell you the name of a few Africans who are today enslaved from Nigeria, they are just like the Israeli girls who were taken into the tunnels. So that's the kind of slavery it is. And of course, in war zones, this does happen. But, in World War II, people got raped, but they probably didn't spend 20 years as a sex slave.
Right. And how is this struggle changed over 30 years? Has there been progress? Has there been backsliding? How do you evaluate, where we are today versus when you first read that article in The Economist?
Okay, so the one thing that did happen through our campaign was that President Bush finally found out about this. This was a decades-long campaign, and we made, we were on CNN, we were on all the news stations, and the Black Caucus at the time. Eleanor Holmes Norton and Senator Donald Payne from New Jersey and others were really upset about this. And so they made a big stink. And President Bush forced Khartoum, the Arab rulers in the north, to allow the South a plebiscite to determine a vote. Do you want to stay or you want to have a separate nation? And so South Sudan, the people that we helped, became the world's newest nation. They voted 99.9, whatever it is, to leave. They became the newest nation. Now, that was good. However, 20 years on, or 25 years on, the jihad has spread to to a lot of Africa. And I can list you 11 or 12 countries who have their Hamas. It's their brand of Hamas. In Algeria, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Libya. By the way, CNN has a film of an auction of 2 Black slaves in Libya. And I could send that to you. Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, Tunisia. So the jihad is spreading through Africa. The main target is African Christians, which, by the way, are the most natural allies of Israelis and Jews in the world. They believe in the Old Testament the way that we believe in the Old Testament. They call me and tell me that, when Israel did well against Iran, that they knew this would happen because they read it in the Bible, that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. So this is an extraordinarily, just forget about the morality of it for a second. Politically, to protect to protect the Christian African community is enormously practically important for the Jewish community. Okay. So it's spread. And like before, the left, this is the most interesting part of this. The left has abandoned black slaves. Imagine the black people who the left won their halos for championing, right, in the beginning, right, has chosen to abandon them because they don't want to criticize history, culture, or practices of any Islamic society. So they've chosen to be intersectional allies of Arabs and blacks here who are minorities, right? Can't say anything against minorities who aren't white. And they've chosen to abandon blacks in Africa who are being oppressed and enslaved and slaughtered by Muslims and Arabs there who are not minorities, they are the majority oppressor. So it's extraordinarily difficult to get this message out and beyond into the mainstream media. We're doing that, but it's hard.
We're doing it here, I hope, a little bit. I just want to say I've seen some of the footage of the Libyan slave markets. I saw them some years ago, and it's shocking to look at. It's something I will never unsee. And I think what also is piercing is this idea that there is a slave market. It sort of helps Americans to understand that this is slavery in the way that we think about it. People being sold. I think I saw a man hung up by his ankles being sold in an open market. And just worth mentioning that there was a big story, I think it might have been The Atlantic a few years ago, about the UAE importing Bangladeshi boys for the camel racing trade. I mean, these markets for slaves exist, and that's important to remember. I wanted to ask you, you talked about the American Black community not supporting Black Africans who are being enslaved. There are major institutions that should be set up exactly for this purpose. NGOs around the world, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, all of these so-called civil rights institutions. Just give us a sense of where they've been, and also the church. These are Christians, and they're being erased from a part of the world. What has the church said, done, or not done on this issue?
Amnesty International will have reports of this, but they won't act on it. And they won't make it a big story. And so they would be the first people to close down New York City about apartheid in South Africa. Why? Because that was bad white people, right? But slavery, which by the way is worse than apartheid, in North Africa, they wouldn't touch it in any important way. I mean, they could always protect themselves by saying, well, we have a report, right? They wouldn't touch it in any important way because it's not about bad whites. And in fact, it's about bad Islamists. And they don't go there. They won't go there. Just like I said, they would rather make the choice to abandon blacks enslaved by Muslims than to break with their leftist framework. That's the biggest sin. And Human Rights Watch is exactly the same way. And sometimes worse, because they actually had really good data that they wouldn't publish. The churches. So Christians in America are not like Jews. I mean, I had this conversation with the Christians, and I yelled at them, "Why don't you do something? Why don't you do something?" And they said, "Dr. Jacobs, we're not like you. You are a family. You have blood ties to Abraham. Whatever happens to a Jew anywhere, it could happen to you here. So you know that, right? We are a creed. And there's this kind of people who believe similar stuff and that kind of people. And they act and they dress so differently, these long beards of, the Eastern Orthodox and those. So we're not a family. And my answer to them is, well, the jihad may cure you of this mistake. But so far, there are Christians who care about it. And Nina Shea, one of my best friends, just wrote a big piece in National Review about the massacre of Christians in Nigeria. Yeah. And, there are people like that, but it's not into the churches. When we bring a former slave, an escaped slave who became famous, Simon Deng, into black churches, people cry. And, when he says to them what happened to him, it's very emotional, but there hasn't yet been a kind of convergence of we must do something about this.
Has any pope ever
I was
talked
going to
about
ask
this?
about the Pope, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, Catholicism is growing in Africa. There was some talk of an African Pope, and yet, I saw Pope Leo's response to the bombing of the church in Damascus, and it was, sort of as milquetoast as you can imagine. And this, of course, is one of Christianity's most ancient sites.
About 8 or 10 years ago, the church was thrashed because there was one papal statement or a statement out of the Vatican that's something about, Islam is not being good to us in Africa.
Yeah, it's Pope Benedict, and
there were riots all over the Islamic world, and they were threatened that if you do this, we're going to kill more Christians. So they have decided. I think it's a cowardly way because the Christians I speak to in Africa want him to say things, but they have decided not to because they're terrorized and cowards.
What is the way to help solve this problem or to make progress? Are we going to just buy back each individual slave from slavery? Are we going to
or is it
abolish
military force?
slavery? Or
is it backing the right side in these different wars? Or
what is there to do besides just putting out statements about how horrified we all are? That doesn't help the actual slave.
No. So I formed the African Jewish Alliance when the Nigerians who live in America, by the way, the Nigerian diaspora is one of the most successful diaspora peoples in the United States. They're doctors, lawyers, real estate businessmen, and their people are being jihaded. And they approached me and they said, we saw what you did in Sudan. Can we do this? We want to unite with the Jews where we have the same enemy. We saw what they did to you on October 7th. It's the same thing, right? So we formed an alliance with Nigerians and Darfuris who are Muslims. We have some people in Somalia. We have South Sudanese, and we're forming this alliance, and we're trying to kind of do what we did 25 years ago. But it's much more difficult because the left is even more angry, more determined not to get this out. So the solution is we can't buy the slaves back. That was a very, very particular possibility then. It's different now. The solution is to convince the Republican Party and the conservatives and the churches in America that this is jihad and that it's coming for them there and, we'll be next. And you have a moral and practical and political reason to scream bloody murder. I mean, I think that but the Biden administration took Nigeria off a watch list, and it needs to be put on. Of course, the State Department is full of people who don't want to deal with war. I don't know now. So let's get to Marco Rubio and he'll fix it. Let's get to Ted Cruz and he'll fix it. Let's get to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump, I think that's the way to go. We have to get to the politicians to do this. And it's also a good political point for the people on the center right. I think that's the way to do it. American power can do it. American calling them out. The poor Christians in Nigeria are unarmed. They're not allowed to have guns. They just have to watch this happen to their villages. They're burning people. They're burning churches. And the only way I can think to do it is to go through the political process here.
And have them do what? What would you ask Donald Trump to do today? Place sanctions on these countries?
Well, first of all, to say it, to have programs about it, to interview escaped slaves about it, to show the Black community, especially the ones who follow him, that this is, you have holy power here because, the Black community here has come up so well. You have to use that power now to free those left behind. He can inspire a movement to do it. He could put sanctions on them. He could scream bloody murder. All kinds of things to happen. We could arm I don't know. He doesn't like to put feet on the ground, but there's a lot he could do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Charles, you've combated this your whole career. There's just a certain difficulty in getting Americans to pay attention to Africa. It's just, it's always been the case. I think, as you mentioned, with George W. Bush, there seemed to be a little bit of a breakthrough in terms of attention to Africa, whether it was PEPFAR, other policy initiatives. How do you kind of, in your experience, how do you kind of break through on the attention front?
I think the world changed. I think that if Black Americans knew this, they would act very, very differently than they acted before. I think if conservative Americans knew this, they would be very interested in doing it, at least the rhetorical part of it, and policy as well. I think if Ted Cruz knew this, we used to have Sam Brown back in the Congress a while back, and who's the other one? Who's the other guy? But there are people who do care, and it just needs recruiting, or don't more organize. Somebody once said that on the left, right? That was
yeah. It also it strikes me as so interesting, right? That we do seem to have an attention span for Africa. USAID was very interested in that part of the world, but didn't exactly spend its dollars to great effect there necessarily. But on issues like this
is verboten. This is taboo. You can't even say it. I'm supposed you'll be canceled. You'll be shut down if you put this podcast on. This is taboo.
Before we say goodbye, I'd love to hear, if you are not going to get too emotional about it, could you tell us a story, a personal story you had on the ground of people you met, a particular person that you met and their experience, so people really understand what we're talking about here?
It is hard not to get emotional because I was there and I saw, I interviewed, this was through Dinka translators, and I have it all on film. We interviewed people who explained how they were taken and how they were impregnated, and how when they came back being redeemed pregnant, they didn't know if their husbands would accept them or accept the child. I did tell you the story that my interview with this young girl, and they told the story of what happened to them when they were captured, raped, mutilated. It's just terrible. And then you think about what happened to the Jewish girls and what's happening to people in Darfur today, who are African Muslims, and who nobody cares about.
Yeah, I can't think of a more important really message on, we're taping this on July 3rd. And just to come back a little bit to where we started. I mean, you sort of, mentioned this sort of Jewish dimension and Passover and the story of liberation. But, to what extent, does your sense of yourself as an American, an inheritor of that tradition kind of inform what you do?
Yeah, look, you're right. Every culture, every religion had slaves. It's not a matter of everybody had slaves. We and the Brits fought to end slavery. We were the abolitionists. We tore our country apart over this. And when I went on Martin Luther King's march, the I Have a Dream speech. I'm older than you guys, and he remembered this, that America was reborn by doing that. And that's who we are. If you want to say who Americans are, we are a people who abolish slavery and will not stand for the idea that one man can own another. And that's who we are. And on this July 4th, we ought to remember that.
Where can people go to find out more, watch those interviews, and find out more about your work?
They can reach me personally, charlesjacobs123@gmail. They can go to iabolish.org, which has those interviews and the Passover scenes. They can go to africanjewishalliance.org to see what we're doing with other African peoples. And I'm happy to speak to anybody about it.
Charles Jacobs, thank you so much for joining us.